I never thought I'd end up writing something like this, but after everything that happened, I have to share it. I used to believe love was about trust, compassion, and building a future. I dated Grace for 2 years and was head over heels for her, or so I thought. Last week, I proposed in front of our closest friends. Everyone cheered, and she seemed so happy. I felt like the luckiest guy alive. I'd picked out a ring she'd once mentioned, and seeing that sparkle in her eyes was incredible. I was sure we'd soon talk about wedding dates and whether we wanted a small ceremony or something bigger. I never expected what happened next. The very next day, her parents invited me over. Grace said they wanted to congratulate us and discuss some details. I should have known something was off. Her parents had always been distant, rarely showing interest in me, but I stayed optimistic, hoping they just needed time. I arrived with a bottle of wine, feeling excited and a bit nervous. After about 5 minutes of small talk, her dad looked me straight in the eye and pushed a piece of paper toward me. It was a typed list of expenses I'd apparently be expected to cover now that I'd proposed. Everything from wedding costs to a new car for Grace, plus part of their mortgage. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about celebrating an engagement, it was truly a cold, calculated demand. I stared at the paper in disbelief. It wasn't just a wedding budget. It included a new car for Grace, a chunk for her parents' mortgage, and even money for her younger sister's tuition. I glanced at Grace, hoping she'd step in and say it was a misunderstanding. Instead, she nodded, as though this was perfectly normal. Her mother chimed in, saying it was tradition for the groom to assume financial obligations. Her father added that he expected me to pay at least half of every item on the list, as a sign of my commitment. I tried to keep my composure, but my mind was racing. This list was more than I earned in a year, and there'd been no prior hint about such demands. I asked why none of this had ever come up before, and her father shrugged, insisting they'd assumed I was aware. Grace silently stared at me, looking annoyed. I tried reasoning that marriage was about partnership, not covering a family's personal debts. Her father shot back, "If you can't handle this, maybe you're not man enough for my daughter." That line nearly made me laugh out loud, but I held it in. I told them calmly that I needed time to think, then left. Grace didn't even walk me to the door. As I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying the entire encounter. I kept asking myself, had I been blind all this time, or had their greed always been lurking, waiting to pounce? That night, I tried to talk to Grace alone, hoping this was some twisted misunderstanding forced by her parents. She picked up on the third call, sounding irritated. I asked why her family expected me to pay for things that went far beyond typical wedding expenses. She said, "You're marrying me, so you're marrying into my family. That comes with responsibilities." I couldn't believe how casually she said it, as if it were obvious. I told her it was more like a shakedown than a wedding plan. She got defensive and snapped, "Don't be dramatic. If you truly love me, you won't be stingy about helping us." I tried to explain that I had my own financial obligations, and this was never something we'd discussed. She said I was being selfish. When I asked her if we could at least compromise, she replied, "There's no compromise on tradition." I felt anger flare inside me. This woman I'd loved for 2 years was acting like I was nothing more than an ATM. I asked, "What if I say no?" Without hesitation, she said, "Then maybe you're not the man I thought you were." That hurt more than I expected. I hung up, still hoping she'd call back with some sanity, but she never did. Instead, the next morning, I got a text from her father telling me not to disrespect them by dragging my feet. He implied he'd come find me if I didn't comply. That's when I realized things might get ugly. I wanted a second opinion, so I shared the situation with 2 close friends. Their reactions were identical, jaws dropping, followed by outrage on my behalf. One buddy suggested maybe Grace's family was in serious debt and saw me as a way out. Another wondered if Grace herself had always planned to rope in a provider who'd pay for everyone. All I knew was that it felt like a betrayal. I tried once more to reach out to Grace, asking for a face-to-face conversation without her parents present. She refused, saying, "My parents want to be involved in every step." I said I didn't want an ambush. She called me paranoid and told me to stop fighting what had to be done. Her dismissive attitude stoked my anger further. This wasn't a partnership, it was a demand for total submission to her family's wishes. I made an appointment to speak with my bank just to see how impossible this financial hit would be. The numbers were staggering. Even if I wanted to help with certain wedding costs, There was no feasible way I could take on her parents' mortgage or her sister's tuition without bankrupting myself. My banker told me bluntly that taking on this level of debt for someone else's obligations was financial suicide. That confirmed my decision. There was no way I'd sign up for this. But instead of slipping away quietly, I felt an urge to show them I wasn't just some meek target. I work in a field that deals with auditing procedures. Nothing shady or illegal, but I do know how to pull public financial records, look up lawsuits, and piece together a paper trail. Out of curiosity, I started searching for Grace's family. It didn't take long to find troubling signs. A previous lawsuit against her father for unpaid loans, multiple refinances on their house, and a canceled business license that might have belonged to her mother. It painted a picture of a family living beyond their means and constantly scrambling to fix their debts. Meanwhile, Grace was posting on social media, hinting that I was backing out of our engagement. She wrote vague statuses about a man who doesn't step up and cultural obligations. Friends began messaging me, asking what was going on. I decided I'd keep quiet for a bit and gather more evidence, let them talk themselves into a corner. Then I got another text from her father. "Don't make this harder. Real men provide. Are you a real man?" The gall of this guy was unreal. I took screenshots of every message, determined to protect myself in case they tried to spin a different story. Part of me still felt stunned that Grace, a woman I thought I'd marry, was letting her family treat me like a piggy bank. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this was all orchestrated. The question was how best to expose them without getting dragged into more threats. I confronted Grace again, insisting we meet in public, somewhere neutral. She refused, so I said, "Fine, I'm done." She tried to guilt trip me, saying I was humiliating her in front of her loved ones. She told me if I left, I'd be proving I was weak. I almost laughed. How could I be weak for refusing to bankroll her entire family? Her father must have sensed the tide turning, because that evening, he left a voicemail that made my blood boil. He said, "If you disrespect us by leaving, I'll make you regret it." He didn't specify how, but his tone was enough to convince me he wasn't above getting physical. I kept the voicemail. By now, I had a growing folder of screenshots, texts, and recordings, everything from their demands to their insults. I tried to return the ring. The jeweler told me I wouldn't get the full amount back, but a partial refund was possible if I had the paperwork. I started to feel a small sense of relief, as if a weight was lifting. There was no way I'd walk down the aisle with someone whose love came with a price tag. But a simple breakup wasn't enough. They'd already begun spreading lies, telling mutual acquaintances I'd led Grace on, then refused to support her. I heard from one friend that Grace was crying about how I'd betrayed her trust. It was such a twisted narrative. I decided I wasn't going to lie down and let them destroy my reputation. I made a carefully worded social media post outlining the basics. We got engaged, then her family blindsided me with an outrageous list of financial demands. I didn't share every detail yet, just enough so people knew I wasn't some heartless fiancé abandoning her. Almost immediately, people who'd seen Grace's posts started commenting, shocked at the contradiction. A few asked for proof. I told them I'd be happy to share receipts if necessary. Grace went ballistic. She commented that I was exaggerating and that I never intended to fulfill my responsibilities. Her father chimed in under her post, calling me a coward. That was my cue. I uploaded screenshots of his threatening texts, with the phone number blurred, and parts of their list, minus sensitive personal data. The reaction was explosive. People were horrified by the amounts they expected me to cover. Others called them out, saying this was manipulative and not normal in any culture they knew. I felt a surge of vindication. Maybe it was petty, but I was tired of being painted as the villain. Grace tried to do damage control, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but I wasn't buying it. I commented under her new post, "Misunderstanding? Your father literally threatened me, and I have it in writing." She deleted that post within minutes. By then, the screenshots were out there. Mutual friends began taking my side, and I realized I might actually come out of this without being branded the bad guy. In the midst of this chaos, I got a surprising call from a man who introduced himself as Todd, an ex-boyfriend of Grace from her college days. He'd seen the social media blow up through mutual connections and wanted to warn me that something similar had happened to him, though not to this extent since they never got engaged. He said her family tried to pressure him into investing in a family business, and when he refused, they turned on him. Hearing his story gave me chills. It confirmed that Grace and her parents had a pattern of targeting whoever she dated, grooming them to fork over large sums. Todd escaped early, but he'd always felt they were using Grace to secure money. We talked for almost an hour, and he encouraged me to stand firm, warning that her father might escalate with more threats. I thanked him and saved his contact in case I needed a witness who'd experienced the same routine. I spent that evening reviewing everything I had: the texts, the voicemails, the screenshots of Grace's social media rants, and Todd's corroborating story. The anger in me turned into a cold resolve. I wasn't just going to walk away quietly. I wanted them to face consequences for their manipulative, predatory behavior. If that meant burning every last bridge, so be it. I was done feeling guilty. They'd revealed their true colors. Let them face the fallout when the people in our social circles learned who they really were. A couple of days later, Grace's father sent one final message: "Pay up or you'll regret it." That was my green light to take this a step further. I went to the local police station and filed a report for harassment, showing them the threatening texts and voicemails. The officer was sympathetic, telling me to keep any new evidence. While they couldn't arrest him yet, having an official record was a strong move in case he tried anything physical. Then I called my friend, a local reporter, explaining the situation in general terms. She was intrigued by the possibility of a story on families who pressure in-laws financially. Though she wasn't sure it would lead to a full piece, she asked to see the evidence. I gave her redacted copies of the texts and told her Todd's account. She said she'd keep it on file, and if her editor found it compelling enough, they might run it. Even if they didn't, having a journalist aware of the situation felt like insurance. Meanwhile, I released a second round of screenshots online addressing rumors Grace's family had tried to spread. I included a snippet of Todd's statement, with his permission, about how he'd been similarly pressured years ago. The backlash against her family grew. Some people commented they'd known Grace to be sweet, but were now questioning everything. Others, who'd been on the fence, started publicly apologizing to me for doubting my side. It felt like the tides had completely turned. Grace began calling incessantly. I let it go to voicemail. One of her messages was a rambling mix of anger and tears, accusing me of destroying her family's reputation. She claimed she never intended for it to go this far and begged me to stop airing our dirty laundry. It was surreal. A week ago, she and her parents were happy to treat me like a human ATM. Now that people were calling them out, she was playing the victim. I saved every voicemail. I didn't respond. Then, out of nowhere, her mother called, crying about how she'd heard I was involving the police. She asked if we could meet privately to resolve things. I declined, telling her any meeting could happen with an officer present. She hung up immediately. I guess that wasn't the resolution they had in mind. At that point, my objective was simple: end the engagement officially, protect myself legally, and ensure they couldn't twist the narrative. I contacted an attorney friend who sent them a formal letter stating that all communication should go through him if they had any claims. It also outlined a no-contact preference, referencing the threats. That seemed to rattle them. Her father sent one more text, furious about being served and accusing me of betraying their culture. I ignored it. My attorney said that if they continued, we could pursue a restraining order. The relief I felt was immense. Finally, I had some leverage that wasn't based on their twisted demands. Word spread fast. People in our community learned that Grace's family wasn't just dealing with wedding costs, but demanding a huge windfall. Old acquaintances of hers came forward, sharing smaller stories of financial pressure they'd faced when visiting her home. Nothing on the scale of what happened to me, but enough to paint a consistent picture. Grace tried to post a long explanation about miscommunication and cultural norms, but the damage was done. Meanwhile, Todd messaged me updates on rumors he was hearing. Supposedly, her father was scrambling because a few of his creditors saw my public posts and realized he was trying to get a bailout. Now they wanted their money sooner. Grace's family, once so proud, was facing actual financial scrutiny they couldn't dodge. I refunded the engagement ring to the extent possible and used part of that money to pay for my lawyer's fees. It was poetic justice, in a way. The ring that symbolized our doomed relationship was funding my defense against their threats. I learned from mutual friends that Grace was furious, claiming I was leaving her with nothing. She even tried to contact my mother, framing the story as if I'd blindsided her with coldness. My mother shut that down fast, telling her, "My son will never forgive a family that threatened him." That was the truth. I had no intention of forgiving them. They betrayed me, tried to extort me, then played the victim. That's not something you forgive. In the end, I emerged from this mess with my finances intact and my self-respect reinforced. I'd exposed their scam to enough people that Grace's family couldn't shift the blame. They lost credibility among friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives who started seeing the pattern of manipulation. I heard they were holed up at home, mortified by the backlash. Grace tried a last-ditch effort to reconcile, leaving a tearful voicemail about how she still loved me and was willing to compromise. It was laughable. Where was that willingness before I went public? I deleted the voicemail without responding. After finalizing my break from them legally and socially, I felt a sense of closure. Yes, I was angry for a while, but more than that, I felt relieved. I dodged a lifetime of being tethered to a family who valued my wallet over my well-being. People asked if I'd ever consider taking Grace back if she apologized. Absolutely not. There's no apology that undoes deliberate greed and calculated threats. My revenge, if you want to call it that, was ensuring their reputation matched their deeds. I didn't forgive them, and I don't regret it. They tried to use me, so I used every scrap of evidence to show the world their true motives. Now they can deal with the fallout on their own. I'm free, and they're left with the debt they hope to dump on me. If anyone reading this faces something similar, trust your instincts. Walking away can be the best form of revenge.